Since 1980, somebody's left a British political party every 12 minutes. If this continues, political parties will have lost all their members within 10 years. At the last election, for every person who voted for the winning Labour Party, 2 didn't vote at all. We don't trust politicians, and we aren't voting for their parties. Maybe it's just because politics has less to do now. It's won us our freedoms, and well, life's just too comfy for us to feel like we need it. The politicians can argue over what little power's left, while we get on with what really interests us. But our lives are full of challenges that cannot be solved by individuals alone. How different cultures and religious faiths coexist, how the new frontiers of scientific knowledge are managed, how to care for a growing elderly population, how to reverse climate change. So it's not because there aren't any problems. And we're definitely not short of people who care about them. In 1991 there were over 98,000 charities in the UK. Now there are over 190,000. 42% of people volunteer every year. 20% of people say they punish people in the decisions they take as consumers. But this doesn't seem enough. Even though we care about these problems, they get us down. Surveys find people becoming more and more pessimistic about the future of society, and yet the same surveys find that people have rarely been so optimistic about their own lives. In Britain, 64% of people are optimistic about their own lives, but only 24% of people are optimistic about society as a whole. The gulf between personal optimism and collective pessimism is one of the striking contradictions of our time, and it lies behind much of our present discontent with politics and democracy. Less respect for tradition and hierarchy, more openness to new lifestyles and values, and easier access to products and cultures that originate on the other side of the world have undoubtedly made our lives freer and easier. But these same forces have fundamentally made the job of governing us all the more difficult. Governments are being asked to tackle more complicated problems when our tolerance for the disappointments that are part and parcel of democracy, the conflicts and the compromise, the overreactions and the slow reactions, is at an all-time low. The result? People are turning their back on democracy. So what do we do? Countless organisations are arguing for a mixture of how votes are counted, more referendums, and ways to make voting easier as a solution. These responses are important, but they risk focusing too much on the institutions that we currently have, and not enough on the wider conditions and cultures under which democracy works. Take voting reform. You could argue that the first-past-the-post system skews us towards a crude two-party system that misrepresents the diversity of political opinion. But Australia, which has one of the most sophisticated proportional representation systems in the world, is suffering from exactly the same democratic shortcomings we do. We tend to describe democratic progress as either making those who govern us more accountable to those who elect them, or consulting people more often on a wider range of decisions. But both of these options ignore where the real threat to democracy comes from the disconnection between personal choices which are easy, immediate and responsive, and collective choices which are difficult, slow and convoluted. And in doing so, they also ignore where the best hopes for revitalising democratic life are, not by tinkering with the formal structures of politics, which to most people are distant and remote, but by connecting democratic choices with people's direct experience of everyday life, and to extend democratic principles to the organisations around us. How we think about saving democracy needs to change. Maybe as well as asking how do we get more people to vote, and how do we increase the membership of political parties, we need to ask, how do we make the institutions of day-to-day life more democratic? How do we make public services more democratic? How do we build more democratic schools, hospitals, libraries and museums? The original democratic ideal was self-government, and that reaches beyond institutions. It describes a way of living together. What do more democratic workplaces look like? More democratic families? More democratic transport, streets and shops? How do markets create public goods? What about social media and personal information? What about eating, playing sport and reading newspapers? The challenges of our time are major challenges of collective adaptation. The solutions will rely on mass changes in individual behaviour and on value commitments. There are no technocratic silver bullets for this. We'll only solve them together. We need democracy that supports this. Everyday democracy.